When a farm girl in Kansas scribbled a Fourier integral on a napkin in a roadside cafe, the entire mathematics department at Princeton paused to reread a theorem forgotten since the 19th century. The wind in Clay Center had a way of singing through the wheat fields, low and endless, like the breath of something ancient that never stopped moving. Most evenings it carried the dry smell of soil and diesel, the hum of trucks on Highway 24, and the faint crackle of the old neon sign above Martha's Diner. Inside that diner, under a single buzzing light, sat a 16-year-old girl with a pencil behind her ear and a napkin spread flat before her. Her name was Emily Grace Carter. She wasn't doing homework that night. There was no schoolwork to do. Her high school had ended the advanced math classes 2 years earlier, and most kids her age spent their evenings helping their families mend fences or watching television. But Emily's world was smaller and deeper, an orbit of coffee cups, chrome counters, and a shelf of discarded textbooks she had rescued from the county library when it closed. Tonight, that shelf had given her a treasure, a cracked, cloth-bound book titled Fourier Series and Boundary Problems, printed in 1957. The spine was faded, and the pages smelled faintly of dust and pencil shavings. Emily traced one of the equations with her finger and whispered softly, almost as if it were a prayer. The idea that a function, something wild and infinite, could be turned into pure frequency fascinated her. To Emily, Fourier's world was not abstract. It was everywhere. The rumble of truck tires, the rustle of wheat, her mother's voice calling across the diner. All of it could be broken into waves and harmonics. Her pencil began to move across the napkin. "Suppose," she murmured, "we take f of x equals sine of x squared divided by x. What happens to its Fourier transform near infinity?" It wasn't homework. It wasn't for any grade. It was a question that had simply been living in her head for days, tapping at her thoughts while she wiped tables and poured coffee. Behind the counter, her mother, Martha, wiped a cup dry and watched her daughter with quiet worry. "You're at it again, Em," she said softly. "You'll wear that pencil to nothing before we close." Emily smiled without looking up. "Just one more line, Mom. I think I'm close." "Close to what?" Emily hesitated, pressing her pencil tip against the napkin until it broke. "Close to hearing what the boundary sounds like," her mother laughed. "The boundary of what?" "The boundary of a function," Emily said, still staring at the napkin. "Where it stops behaving, where the symmetry falls apart." Martha shook her head gently. She didn't understand a word of it, but she knew that look. Those wide eyes, the small furrow between the brows, the hush that came when Emily fell into her own mind. It was the same look her late husband used to have when he repaired old engines, listening for the rhythm that told him everything was working just right. At the corner table, the diner's only other customer that night, a trucker heading to Denver, watched her with faint amusement. "What's the kid studying?" he asked. "Math," Martha replied. He chuckled. "Ain't much use for that out here." Martha smiled politely, though something in her chest tightened. If only he knew, she thought. If only he knew what that napkin might mean to her. The clock struck 11. Emily flipped the napkin over and began writing again, slower this time, whispering numbers under her breath. The pencil scratched softly as she worked through the limits. She paused. Something felt wrong. The integral she was testing should decay smoothly as the frequency increased, but the edges of the function behaved strangely. Instead of vanishing, part of the boundary seemed to remain. She frowned. The old book's rule, the Riemann-Lebesgue lemma, said that every reasonable function's Fourier transform should fade to zero as the frequency grew. But here, something resisted that fading. She wrote on the napkin, "Boundary does not forget." Then beneath it, "Maybe the boundary remembers what the integral forgot." It was only a sentence, half poetry and half mathematics. But when she read it aloud, the words felt heavier than anything she had ever written. Outside, lightning flickered across the plains. The wind pushed hard against the diner's glass, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hum, a low, vibrating tone that Emily imagined as the Earth's own frequency, the bass note of solitude. She turned the napkin sideways, thinking of another way to handle the limits. Her pencil trembled as she tried different paths in her mind. The result seemed to hinge on a fragile balance between oscillation and decay, between the harmony of sine and the fading of 1 over x. If even a small asymmetry existed, the transform might not disappear completely. It might hold, faintly, a memory of its boundary. She had no computer, no calculator, only her thoughts. And yet, she could see it. In her imagination, waves collided, bent, broke apart. It was as if she could hear them whispering to one another, the low tones fading slower than the high ones, the tale of the transform refusing to die. By midnight, Martha had shut off the coffee machine. The diner was empty now except for the ticking clock and the sound of the wind pressing against the doorframe. Emily gathered her napkins, 7 of them, covered in symbols and tiny notes, and folded them carefully into her notebook. "Heading to bed?" Martha asked. "In a bit," Emily said. "I just want to copy this before I forget." She opened her worn notebook, the one she had labeled Things That Don't Vanish. On the first line of the new page, she wrote the date, March 3rd, 1998, and beneath it, one question. If a function fades, does its boundary still sing? She didn't know it yet, but those words would one day travel 1,000 miles, carried accidentally in a box of donated books to Princeton University, where a mathematician named Robert Hensley would read them under a yellow lamp and whisper, astonished. "She's touched the imbalance Hardy lamented, the place where symmetry breaks." Outside, dawn began to rise over the wheat fields. Emily leaned her head against the cool window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought of her father, gone too soon, who used to say that numbers could explain the wind if you just listened closely enough. Now, as the first light touched the land, Emily listened. The wind answered, not in words, but in rhythm, in something she would one day learn to call a transform. She smiled faintly and whispered to herself, "Maybe the world is just one long equation, waiting to be understood." For a brief, luminous moment, the diner, the wind, and the quiet hum of the earth seemed to become the same infinite line, something vanishing, yet never truly gone. Spring came slowly to Clay Center. The winter wind softened into a tired sigh, and the wheat fields began to tremble again under thin blades of green. In Martha's diner, the rhythm of days remained the same. Coffee poured, plates clattered, and the radio murmured the same country songs between long silences. Emily still worked behind the counter, her notebook never far from reach. The napkins from that night had been carefully copied into its pages. She didn't know if what she'd written mattered to anyone else, but to her it felt like a secret she needed to protect. Sometimes she caught herself staring at those equations the way some people stare at family photographs, tenderly, almost in awe. Her mother noticed the way she'd drift off, pencil hovering in the air. "You're thinking again?" Martha would say, smiling. "Always," Emily replied softly. When business was slow, Emily sat by the window and reread her old library books. Some were falling apart, their margins crowded with notes from students long gone. One day, while helping her mother pack boxes of used books for a charity drive organized by a nearby church, Emily hesitated. She placed her notebook inside one of the boxes, just for a moment, while she cleared space on the counter. Then the lunch crowd came in, and the box was sealed before she could take it back. That box traveled a long way. It was loaded into the back of a church van, sent to a second-hand bookstore in Topeka, then donated again to a college library in New Jersey. From there, during a spring cleanup, it found its way into a pile of old academic materials shipped to a mathematics conference at Princeton University. The label read simply, Educational Supplies, MISC. Inside that box, between two worn textbooks and a bundle of notes written on diner napkins, rested Emily's notebook. Things that don't vanish. In an office filled with books and silence, Professor Robert Hensley sat reviewing materials for the upcoming conference. He was a tall, pale man with the weary patience of someone who had spent too many years staring at chalkboards. His specialty was harmonic analysis, the study of how waves, signals, and patterns could be understood by breaking them apart into frequencies. He often said that to study Fourier transforms was to listen to mathematics itself. That morning he was searching for new examples of non-vanishing Fourier tails, rare functions that refused to decay neatly at infinity. Most of the submissions were routine, variations on known theorems. He sipped his coffee without interest until he noticed a stack of handwritten papers, folded and bound by a thin ribbon. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded in places. Across the first page was a title written in pencil. Maybe the boundary remembers what the integral forgot. He frowned, intrigued. It was not the title of any known paper. Beneath it, in a different hand, was a list of computations that looked impossibly careful for a high schooler, yet carried the unmistakable fingerprints of raw intuition. He turned the pages slowly. Each contained small mistakes, crossed-out terms, and questions scribbled in the margins. But the pattern was unmistakable. At the bottom of one page, a sentence stood out. The decay fails if oscillation dominates before convergence settles. The boundary still sings. Robert leaned back in his chair. He reread the line several times. To most mathematicians, it might have sounded like poetic nonsense, but he understood. It described something real, a delicate tension between symmetry and decay, the same tension G.H. Hardy had written about a century ago. And whoever had written these pages had touched it without even realizing. He turned another sheet. On the back was a note, written in smaller letters. Test, sine of x squared divided by x. Then below that, possible exception to Riemann-Lebesgue. Robert put down his coffee. Good God, he whispered. He pulled out a notebook and quickly reconstructed the computation. Within minutes, he saw it. The peculiar boundary condition that could, under specific transformations, prevent total decay. It wasn't a discovery that would rewrite history, but it was beautiful, precise, intuitive, and completely original. And yet there was no name, only initials written faintly in pencil. EGC. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Martha's diner. The envelope bore the Princeton crest and the signature of Robert Hensley. Martha found it wedged among bills and flyers. She opened it while refilling the sugar jars. Dear Miss Carter, it began. My name is Professor Robert Hensley, Department of Mathematics, Princeton University. A few months ago, a notebook containing your handwritten notes was received in a shipment of educational materials. After reviewing your work, I believe you have independently rediscovered a non-trivial boundary case related to the Riemann-Lebesgue lemma. I would like to invite you to correspond with me regarding your findings and, if possible, to visit our department for discussion. Sincerely, Robert Hensley. Martha read the letter twice before calling her daughter. Emily, she said carefully, you need to come look at this. Emily came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the Princeton letterhead, she froze. I didn't send anything to Princeton, she said. I think you did, her mother whispered. By accident. Emily sat down, staring at the words. The letter trembled in her hands. They read it? She said. They actually read it? They sure did, honey. She pressed the letter to her chest. For the first time in her life, someone beyond the dusty county line had seen her handwriting and understood it. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, thinking of what it meant. Princeton. She had seen the name only in the tiny print at the bottom of old research papers. She had never even met a mathematician. The next morning, she took her notebook and sat in the empty diner before dawn. The sky was still gray. She opened a clean page and began to write a reply, but the words would not come. What could she possibly say to a man who lived in a world of equations and conferences and chalkboards taller than she was? Finally, she wrote, "Dear Professor Hensley, I don't know how my notes reached you, but I'm glad they did. I didn't mean to send them anywhere. I just wanted to understand why things fade, and sometimes don't. I'm not sure if my math is right, but the thought felt true. Thank you for reading it. Sincerely, Emily G. Carter." She folded the letter neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it in the outgoing mail tray behind the counter. For the rest of the day, she felt strangely light, as if part of her had already begun to travel east. In Princeton, a week later, Robert Hensley received her reply. He smiled as he read it. The handwriting was uncertain, but the humility of her words struck him deeply. He thought of the many students he had taught, brilliant, confident, often careless, and realized that none had written with such quiet sincerity. He drafted a response that same night. "Dear Emily, your insight into the boundaries behavior was extraordinary. You've touched on a question many overlook because it lies in the gray area between analysis and intuition. If you ever wish to learn formally, I would be honored to guide you. Yours sincerely, Robert Hensley." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a postscript. "Mathematics remembers kindness as much as it remembers rigor." Back in Kansas, life continued as it always had. The fields ripened, the trucks passed, the diner stayed open late. But inside Emily's notebook, something had changed. Her handwriting grew steadier. Her questions became longer. At night, she practiced calculus by candlelight, trying to understand everything she had written months ago. Sometimes she paused and whispered lines from Professor Hensley's letter to herself, not to memorize them, but to feel them. Her mother would watch her from the doorway, a soft pride in her eyes. "Do you really think he'll write again?" Martha asked one evening. "I think so," Emily said. "Math people don't forget." She smiled then, shy but certain. The wind rattled the window panes, and somewhere beyond the fields, a train sounded its long, low whistle, like the note of a wave that never fades completely. That spring, a small brown envelope arrived again from New Jersey. Inside it was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences written in neat script. "The line between vanishing and surviving is thin, Emily, but sometimes what refuses to vanish becomes the most beautiful part of the whole function." Emily read it 3 times, then slipped it into her notebook, between her equations and the napkin drawings. She didn't tell anyone about it, not even her mother. But from that day on, every time she looked at the endless plains stretching outside the diner windows, she imagined them as a kind of graph, waves and boundaries, decaying and surviving in equal measure. And for the first time in her young life, she understood that learning was not something given. It was something discovered again and again in the quiet hum of the world. The wind had turned warm again by mid-June. In Clay Center, Kansas, that meant the dust along Highway 24 lifted like ghosts and settled back in slow, lazy spirals over the wheat. The diner's old fans spun overhead, tired but loyal, stirring air that smelled of coffee and baked bread. Emily Grace Carter had grown used to the rhythm of those early summer mornings, the hiss of the griddle, her mother's steady humming, and the bell above the door that rang whenever someone came in for pie or a refill. It was a quiet life, predictable in its small details, and for weeks after the second letter from Princeton, she had almost convinced herself that everything would remain exactly as it was. Almost. Because there was something new in her days now, a pulse that lived beneath the ordinary. Every time the mail truck passed, her heart lifted a little. Every time the phone rang, she listened just a second longer before answering. She had written to Professor Hensley twice since spring. Her first real letter had contained a neat proof correcting one of her earlier mistakes. The second had been more daring. She asked if the behavior of her strange boundary case might connect to any physical system, perhaps sound waves or heat distribution, or even the faint resonance she sometimes heard in the diner when the coffee machine vibrated against the counter. She did not expect an answer. Then, one late afternoon, the phone behind the counter rang. It was an old rotary phone, beige and slightly cracked, and it rarely rang for anything except delivery orders. Martha answered it with her usual tired cheer. "Martha's Diner. What can I get for you today?" A pause. Then her eyes widened slightly. "Hold on. Emily, I think this one's for you." Emily wiped her hands on a towel and took the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was gentle, slightly formal, and carried the faint hum of distance. "Miss Carter? This is Robert Hensley from Princeton." Her knees nearly gave way. She gripped the counter hard enough for her knuckles to pale. "Oh, Professor, Yes, this is Emily." "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," he said. "I wasn't sure if letters were reaching you properly. I thought perhaps we might speak directly." She swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "They reached me, sir. Every one of them." There was a small chuckle on the other end. "Good. You have no idea how refreshing it is to receive letters like yours. You write with the precision of a scholar and the wonder of a child. That combination is rare, even among mathematicians." Emily felt her face warm. "I just like to understand things." "That's how it begins," he said kindly. A silence followed, gentle, not awkward. She could hear faint rustling in his office, perhaps the turning of pages. "I wanted to ask you," he continued, "about your question regarding physical systems. You wrote that you could feel the same pattern in the vibration of your coffee machine?" "Yes," she said. "When it's almost empty, it hums differently, like it's holding back a note. I wondered if that was what the boundary of a function feels like when it refuses to vanish." There was a long pause. Then quietly he said, "Emily, do you know what you just described?" "I'm not sure." That's almost exactly how Lord Kelvin explained resonance to his students in 1883. He said every system, no matter how small, keeps a memory of its boundary, the place where energy reflects rather than disappears. Emily's heart thudded. "So I wasn't imagining it." "No," Hensley said. "You weren't. You were hearing mathematics." Her mother leaned in, trying to understand who her daughter was speaking to, but Emily had turned away, her face lit by something brighter than sunlight. "Professor," she said softly, "I don't know what to do with all this. I feel like I'm standing in front of something big, but I don't have the right tools." He hesitated, then spoke with the patience of a teacher who had waited years to find the right student. "Would you be willing to learn formally? We could arrange materials for you, introductory calculus, differential equations, maybe even harmonic analysis. I could guide you through letters and calls if your time allows." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "You mean study? With you?" "Yes. Unofficially, of course, but mathematics does not care about official titles. It cares about truth and persistence." She could barely breathe. "I don't have a computer," Or even good paper, really. That's all right, he said. You seem to do fine with napkins. She laughed, surprised by the warmth in his tone. After the call ended, she stood motionless for a long time, the receiver still in her hand. The sound of the diner returned slowly, the fan, the distant radio, the low hum of life continuing as before, but she knew that nothing inside her was the same anymore. Martha approached quietly. "Who was that, honey?" Emily looked at her mother, eyes shining. "It was Princeton." Martha blinked. "You mean that fancy professor again?" "Yes, he wants to teach me." Her mother stared for a long moment, then pulled her daughter into her arms. "Then you let him," she whispered. "You let him teach you everything he can." The weeks that followed were unlike any in Emily's life. Every few days, a thick envelope would arrive from New Jersey, filled with handwritten notes and exercises. Hensley's writing was neat, but slightly slanted, each page covered in careful explanations. He started with simple topics, limits, derivatives, integrals. But he treated them with the respect of philosophy rather than arithmetic. He explained not just how they worked, but why they mattered. Every derivative, he wrote, is a story of change. Every integral, a memory of what has been lost. Emily devoured the lessons. At night, when the diner was quiet, she spread her papers across the counter and worked by the light of the old hanging bulb. Sometimes her mother would fall asleep in the back room while Emily's pencil kept moving, steady and sure. Her progress astonished even her teacher. In one of his letters, he confessed, "I used to believe that genius was the product of rare birth or rare education. You, Emily, have forced me to reconsider. Perhaps genius is simply honesty, the ability to see the world exactly as it is." She read that line so many times that the paper grew thin where her thumb rested. By August, the heat had thickened. Cicadas screamed from the trees, and the wheat fields shimmered under a sky so bright it hurt to look at. One afternoon, another letter arrived. Different this time. The envelope was larger, heavier, and bore the Princeton seal in gold. Inside was a single sheet. It read, "To Miss Emily Grace Carter, we are pleased to invite you to attend the annual Princeton Summer Seminar for Young Mathematicians as a guest observer. Your correspondence with Professor Robert Hensley has drawn great admiration. Travel arrangements and expenses will be provided. We would be honored by your presence." Emily sat at the counter, letter trembling in her hands. Martha came over, wiping her apron. "Is it another one from him?" Emily looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, they want me to come there." Martha blinked, not understanding. "To New Jersey?" "To Princeton." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind outside shifted, carrying the dry scent of wheat and dust through the open door. Martha finally said, "Then we'll find a way." That night, Emily stood outside the diner long after closing. The highway was empty, the stars sharp and endless above her. She thought about how small Clay Center looked from the sky, how easily the whole town might fit inside a single page of her notebook. She whispered to herself, "What if I'm not good enough?" But then she remembered Hensley's words from their call. Mathematics does not care about titles. It cares about truth and persistence. So she went back inside, opened her notebook, and began to study again, slowly, carefully, the way the wind studies the fields before it moves. By the time dawn crept over Kansas, Emily had solved every problem in the packet. Her last line, written in her small, precise hand, was a sentence rather than an equation. Every boundary hums before it fades. It was the thought she would carry with her when she finally boarded the bus east. a quiet girl from a roadside diner, chasing the memory of a boundary that refused to vanish. The morning Emily left Kansas, the air was clear and still. Her mother, Martha, packed a paper sack with sandwiches and coffee, hands moving quietly, eyes never quite meeting her daughter's. Neither spoke much. Some partings are too full for words. The bus stop was nothing more than a cracked bench and a sign bent by wind. Emily carried a small duffel, 2 shirts, her notebook, and the invitation from Princeton. Martha pressed a 20 into her palm. "For what the world forgets to give," she said. When the bus door closed, the sound seemed final. As the town slipped behind her, Emily whispered to herself, "The first step is always a boundary condition." The road stretched endlessly east. Fields gave way to towns, towns to cities. At each stop, she unfolded Hensley's letter and read it again. "You may enter as a guest observer. If anyone looks surprised, let them. Mathematics belongs to the listener." She smiled faintly. To her, that sentence was permission to exist. Night settled over Missouri, and she wrote in her notebook by the dim bus light, "Distance is just another variable. What matters is the shape of the function." In Chicago, the station swarmed with voices and motion. Emily felt both lost and alive. The noise reminded her of Fourier transforms, every sound a frequency waiting to be separated and understood. By dawn, the bus entered Pennsylvania. She could not sleep, so she rehearsed the logic that had carried her this far. If a function oscillates near zero but fails symmetry, the transform might not fade. Somewhere in that imbalance lay truth, and perhaps beauty. Princeton arrived under a soft rain. The streets were lined with elm trees, their leaves shining like wet brass. Emily followed the map from Hensley's letter to a stone building marked Department of Mathematics. The hallway smelled of chalk and quiet. A secretary handed her a visitor badge. "First talk starts in room 204, she said kindly. "You're right on time." Emily smiled. She'd crossed 1,000 miles and was still on time. The lecture that morning was about the heat equation. The professor explained how warmth spreads through metal, how temperature smooths itself across space and time. Emily copied every phrase. Smoothing is the cousin of vanishing, she thought. But boundaries remember. At the break, she stood alone by the window. Outside, rain fell on a small courtyard. For the first time, she felt peace. She didn't need to belong. She only needed to understand. "Miss Carter?" She turned. Professor Hensley stood in the doorway, taller than she had imagined, with kind eyes behind silver glasses. "I'm very glad you came," he said. "Thank you for inviting me." "Walk with me after the next talk," he said. "We'll find a quiet room and look at your notes. There's no rush. You're not here to impress anyone. You're here to see what's real." She nodded, relief softening her shoulders. Later that afternoon, they sat in a small seminar room lit by tall windows. The board was clean, the erasers white. Hensley gestured to the chalk. "Show me what you saw in Kansas," he said. Emily stood, took a breath, and wrote in careful letters, "We study an integrable function that refuses to vanish." Her voice steadied as she described the balance between decay and oscillation, the way symmetry allowed cancellation, and how, when that symmetry broke, something of the function endured. When she finished, she stepped back. Chalk dust covered her fingertips. Hensley nodded slowly. "Clear. Faithful. The idea is small but exact. You've found where memory hides in analysis." Her throat tightened. "It's nothing special," she said. "It is," he replied, "because it's honest." They worked quietly for an hour, testing small corrections. When they were done, Hensley smiled. "Tomorrow, sit in on calculus wine. You'll know it already, but it's good to hear the melody again. Sometimes the simplest line tells you why you began. Emily nodded. I'd like that. As she walked out, sunlight spilled across the hallway floor. For the first time in her life, she felt not out of place, but precisely placed, like a note that had found its chord. That night, in the guest house, she opened her notebook and wrote one line before sleeping. The road east did not make me larger. It made me exact. Then she closed the book, turned out the light, and let herself rest in the quiet hum of a world that had finally heard her. The morning sun fell through the tall windows of the guest house, soft and golden. Emily woke before the campus stirred, her notebook still open beside her pillow. The last line she had written, "The road east did not make me larger, it made me exact," seemed truer in daylight. She dressed quietly and walked toward the mathematics building. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and pine. Bells marked the hour as she passed the old chapel. Every sound felt sharper here, more deliberate, as if the town itself spoke in measured frequencies. When she entered room 112 for the Calculus I lecture, students were already settling in. They looked young and confident, chatting easily before the class began. Emily slipped into the back row. She expected to be invisible, as she often was at home, but the professor noticed her at once, a stranger with a quiet face and a borrowed badge. "Welcome," he said simply, then turned to the board. He began with a line of chalk that ran clean across the slate. "The derivative is the language of change." Emily listened. She had seen the rule 100 times, yet hearing it here in this quiet room felt like hearing an old song played on a better instrument. The professor spoke of limits and slopes, of the way motion could be measured by the smallest pieces of time. Then he moved to the integral, the sum that restores what has been divided. "As you take the integral," he said, "you are giving back what differentiation took away." Emily smiled faintly. It sounded like forgiveness. After class, she lingered in the hallway. Through an open window, she heard the faint whistle of wind through the courtyard trees, a sound so clean it reminded her of Kansas, the wheat fields, the endless hum of air. She found Professor Hensley waiting near the stairwell. He had 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "I thought you might need one," he said. "Thank you." They sat on a bench by the window. The building smelled faintly of dust and chalk. "How was it?" he asked. "It was beautiful," she said. "Simple things always are." He said integration gives back what's been taken. I thought, maybe that's what understanding is, taking back what the world forgot. Hensley nodded. "That's closer to truth than most definitions I've heard." He took a sip of coffee, studying her face. "You remind me of a student I once had. Brilliant, but impatient. He wanted answers more than understanding. You're the opposite. You're patient enough to listen to silence." Emily looked down at her hands. Silence is where the answers live. Later that day, during a short seminar, Hensley introduced her quietly to the group. He did not speak of her age or where she came from, only that she had noticed something unusual in a Fourier integral and had come to share her thoughts. When the floor opened for discussion, a graduate student asked, half curious, half condescending, "So, Miss Carter, what drew you to Fourier analysis of all things?" Emily paused. Her hands felt cool against the notebook on her lap. "Because it sounds like home," she said. The room went still. She continued softly. "At night in Kansas, when the wind moves through wheat, it carries more than one note. You can hear low tones fading slow and high ones that vanish quick. I thought maybe that was what the transform looked like. Some parts disappearing faster, some staying longer. The sound of memory, maybe." No one laughed. Even the skeptical student leaned forward, curious. Hensley watched her closely, saying nothing. After the seminar, he found her in the hallway again. "You spoke like a mathematician today," he said. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I was just talking about home." "Then perhaps that's what a mathematician is," he said gently. "Someone who translates the sound of home into logic." They spent the afternoon in his office, the blinds half drawn against the light. Emily spread her notes across the desk, and together they refined her boundary argument. Hensley suggested a new example, one that connected directly to physical heat flow. "If we treat your function as a pulse of heat," he said, "your boundary term becomes the last warmth clinging to the metal before it cools." Emily nodded slowly. "So even when the temperature fades, part of it remembers." "Exactly. That memory is not failure. It's identity." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the radiator filled the silence. That evening, walking back through the campus, Emily thought of her father. She imagined him standing outside the diner, watching the horizon turn gold. He used to tell her that nothing truly disappears, it only changes form. Energy, sound, light, all traveling somewhere new. Perhaps, she thought, that was what her equation meant. Not a mystery of mathematics, but a truth about living things. The world loses and gains in equal measure. Even the smallest note of kindness or memory leaves a trace, a residual term that refuses to vanish. She sat on the stone bench under the maple, where rainwater still clung to the leaves. Pulling her notebook from her bag, she wrote, "The boundary remembers because it has known warmth. Decay is not forgetting, it is transformation." The words came easily, steady as breath. Later, Hensley passed through the courtyard and saw her still writing. He didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than praise. When she finally returned to her room, the campus was dark. She placed her notebook on the desk and stared at the last line she had written. For the first time, she felt she understood what learning was. Not a race toward mastery, but a slow reconciliation between what fades and what endures. She whispered to herself, "Every equation is a way home." Then she turned off the lamp, the faint hum of the city beyond the trees, echoing the same long note she'd heard all her life. And in that quiet room, far from the wheat and wind, Emily Grace Carter slept with peace that felt earned, like a solved problem whose answer had always been waiting in the margins. By the second week of the seminar, Princeton had begun to feel like another planet, one that spoke the same language but carried it differently, with confidence instead of hunger. The mornings smelled of rain and chalk. The evenings hummed with quiet talk in hallways where the light never seemed to go out. Emily had settled into her rhythm, lectures in the morning, long hours in the library after lunch, a quiet walk back through the maple courtyard each night. She still felt like a guest at someone else's table, but she no longer feared it. She had learned to move softly, to listen more than she spoke, and to measure her confidence not by what she knew, but by how clearly she could see what she didn't. That afternoon, Professor Hensley gave her a new problem to think about, one that he warned was both beautiful and cruel. He placed a sheet of paper on the desk. On it was written a single equation, UT E du plus GXT. The inhomogeneous heat equation, he said. The term G represents a source. Imagine heat not only spreading but being born and lost at every moment. The question is whether the solution still smooths out in time, or whether the new energy keeps the system restless. Emily stared at it. "So even light can be restless," she said. Hensley smiled. "Yes, especially light." That night she carried the equation back to her small room in the guest house. The walls glowed faintly from a desk lamp, and the page in front of her seemed to breathe. She had seen the homogeneous version before, the simple diffusion of warmth. But this new one felt different. Alive. The source term pulsed like a heartbeat. She began to work. Slowly at first, then faster, her pencil racing to keep up with her thoughts. If GXT fades quickly, she reasoned, the system behaves like before. But if G lingers, if it feeds the boundary faster than diffusion can smooth it, then something remains, some echo of the source. Her mind wandered back to Kansas. The diner's coffee machine always clicked twice before shutting down, releasing one last puff of steam. That was the source term, she realized, the leftover heartbeat in an otherwise cooling system. She wrote in the margin, "Heat fades, but light remembers." At midnight, she took her work to the common study room. The large windows were black mirrors reflecting her pale face. She filled 3 pages with calculations, tested boundaries, changed variables, until exhaustion dulled her pencil strokes. At last, she leaned back, whispering to the empty room, "If something keeps creating light, the darkness can never win completely." She smiled at the thought. It sounded more like her mother than a theorem. Then she boxed her final line. If G has compact support, U tends to a memory of G. She didn't know it yet, but that single line would become the seed of her later research, a bridge between mathematics and the physics of persistence. The next morning, she showed her work to Hensley. He read in silence, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of pride and disbelief. "You've just proved a special case of the persistence theorem for bounded sources," he said. Emily blinked. "I did?" "You did," he said, smiling. "And you did it by listening to the problem. That's rare. Most people attack equations. You let them talk." She looked down, embarrassed but glowing. "It just made sense," she said. "If something keeps giving, how could the world go back to zero?" "That's not only mathematics," Hensley said softly. "That's life." Word of her insight spread quietly through the small circle of seminar students. Some reacted with curiosity, others with skepticism. One afternoon, a graduate student named Michael cornered her in the hallway. "So you're the one who found the persistence thing," he said, half smiling. "Hensley's miracle from Kansas." Emily flushed. "It wasn't a miracle, just patience." "Patience doesn't prove theorems," he said. "Maybe not," she replied, "but it keeps you long enough to hear them." He didn't have an answer for that. That evening, after the last lecture, Hensley invited her to walk with him to the observatory hill behind the campus. The air was cooling, and the horizon glowed with the last orange trace of sunset. "You know," he said, "Fourier's original work was done to explain heat flow in metal rods. But it became the language of sound, of signal, even of light. The idea that one pattern could explain so many worlds, that's why I never left this field." Emily looked toward the dim horizon. "And yet, everything still ends in silence." He nodded. "Yes, but silence is not the absence of sound. It's the boundary where one frequency stops and another begins." They stood there for a while, watching the light fade into soft blues. "Professor," she said quietly, "do you ever miss where you came from?" "Every day," he said. "But every equation I write is a way of remembering it." She smiled. "That's what I thought." Back in her room, she wrote down what she had learned. Not only the equation, but the feeling that came with it. The persistence of heat is not defiance. It is faith, the belief that what was once warm can be warm again. Then she turned off the lamp. The campus lights flickered faintly outside, little points of reason against the dark. For the first time, she understood what it meant to see the world through mathematics, not cold, not mechanical, but human. full of memory and promise. She closed her notebook, whispering into the quiet, "Even light refuses to vanish." And in that truth, she felt closer than ever to home. The leaves on the Princeton maples had begun to turn faintly gold. Summer was fading, though the air still held its warmth. For Emily, each day now felt both fragile and full, as if something important was approaching, something she had not yet earned but would soon have to face. It came one afternoon in late August. Professor Hensley stopped by her desk in the library and set down a folded paper. "They've added you to the end of tomorrow's seminar," he said gently. "A short presentation, 10 minutes, no more. You'll speak on your boundary case and the persistence theorem." Emily froze. "Me? Present?" "Yes," he said, smiling. "You've worked too quietly. It's time the room hears you." "But I'm not—" She stopped herself. "I'm not ready for Princeton." "No one ever is," Hensley said. "That's why we come." He walked away before she could protest again. That night, Emily sat at the small desk in her guest house room, staring at a blank page. The lamplight trembled slightly, casting her shadow across the notebook. She wrote the title, "Boundaries That Remember." Beneath it, she outlined her argument: the way asymmetry in a function's decay could preserve a fragment of energy. How that same idea, translated to the heat equation, described persistence rather than disappearance. It was all there, clear, even simple, until she imagined the faces of those who would listen, the professors, the graduate students, the quiet murmurs of judgment that floated in any academic room. Her hands began to shake. She closed the notebook and went outside. The courtyard was empty except for the fountain in the center, its water murmuring like thought. She sat on the stone edge and breathed. The night air smelled of wet leaves. In Kansas, the stars would have been blazing above her. Here, the light from campus softened them into a gray glow. "Mathematics doesn't need you to be loud," she whispered to herself. "It just needs you to be faithful." The next afternoon, the seminar room filled quickly. Chalkboards covered 2 walls, their black surfaces already marked by half-erased notes. Emily took the back corner seat, clutching her folder. Her name on the program looked wrong somehow, too formal beside others. E.G. Carter, guest presentation. The talks before hers passed like static. She heard words: compactness, Laplacian, transform domain. But none of them stayed. Her heart beat in slow, heavy waves. When her turn came, Hensley gave her a small nod from the side row. She walked to the front. Her shoes felt too loud on the tile. When she turned, the room was quiet. She could see faces she didn't know, expectant but not unkind. "My name is Emily Carter," she began. Her voice wavered once, then steadied. "I come from Clay Center, Kansas. I'm not a student here. I'm a visitor who listens." A few smiles, no laughter, encouraging silence. She turned to the board and wrote in large, careful letters, "A function may fade, yet its boundary may remember." Then she spoke slowly, explaining how she had first seen the idea not in a classroom, but in sound. The hum of a coffee machine in her mother's diner. She described the failure of symmetry, how one side of a function might hold just enough strength to keep its echo alive. She showed how the same principle could be found in the heat equation when a small source kept burning inside an otherwise cooling system. "This," she said, drawing a small wave that refused to vanish, "is what I call persistence. It is not rebellion. It is continuity, the faith of a function that refuses to forget where it began." She stopped. The room was silent. No shifting papers, no whispers, just that vast and sacred stillness that every true explanation hopes for. Hensley's eyes were bright. "Questions?" he said finally. A tall student raised his hand. "You're saying that the limit doesn't reach zero because of asymmetry?" "Yes," Emily said. "Because one side gives more than the other." "But isn't that instability?" "It's memory," she answered. "Stability doesn't always mean stillness." The student nodded slowly, half smiling. There were no more questions. After the seminar, several professors approached to shake her hand. One of them, a thin woman with sharp eyes, said quietly, "Your intuition is remarkable. Hold on to that. Proof will come, but intuition is rarer." When they were gone, Hensley remained at the back of the room. He waited until the last student had left, then turned to her. "How do you feel?" Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Like I just stepped into the wind." "And?" "And it didn't knock me over." Hensley laughed softly. "That's the best result we can hope for." He erased the board slowly, leaving only the first line she had written. "A function may fade, yet its boundary may remember." Then he looked at her. "Keep that one. It's yours." That evening, Emily walked alone through the campus. The sky was painted in soft rose light, the kind that fades before anyone notices. She passed the chapel, the library, the rows of bicycles leaning neatly against stone walls. The world around her felt balanced. Equations in motion, nothing lost, nothing wasted. By the time she reached the guest house, the first stars had begun to appear. She sat by the window, opened her notebook, and wrote, "Silence is not emptiness. It is proof that understanding has occurred." Then, on the next line, "When I spoke, they listened. When they were silent, I knew I was home." She closed the notebook, rested her head against the glass, and watched the lights of Princeton flicker softly in the distance. Somewhere behind those windows, people were still working, still writing, still chasing the same clarity she had glimpsed that afternoon. And for the first time, she didn't feel small among them. She felt steady, like the faint, enduring note of a boundary that refused to vanish. By September, the leaves on the Princeton maples had turned to flame. The wind moved through them with the same rhythm as Kansas wheat, a whispering sound that reminded Emily of home every time she heard it. Her days fell into a quiet pattern: morning lectures, long afternoons in the library, evenings spent walking through the stone courtyards. Her presentation at the seminar had changed something invisible but real. Professors now greeted her by name. Graduate students paused to ask small questions. But Emily herself hadn't changed. She still carried her notebook everywhere, still wrote on diner napkins folded into its back pocket. The letter from her mother came that week, addressed simply, "Miss Emily Carter, Princeton Guest House, New Jersey." Inside was a photo of the diner, sunlit, almost empty, and a note in Martha's soft, looping script. "The mornings are quieter without you. Your old shelf of books is still by the coffee maker." Sometimes the regulars ask after the girl with the math pages. I tell them you're studying somewhere bright. Don't forget to eat. Don't forget who you are. Love, Mom. Emily read it twice, then folded it carefully between the pages of her notebook. That night, she walked out to the field beyond the observatory, where the stars glowed faint and cold. She thought of her mother wiping tables, of the sound of the coffee machine, her first Fourier signal. The memory filled her chest with an ache that was not quite sadness, not quite joy. The next morning, she found Professor Hensley in his office, surrounded by stacks of papers and an old blackboard covered with equations like constellations. "I've been thinking," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "You'll be returning home soon, yes?" "Next week," she said. The seminar ends Friday. He nodded slowly. Then let me give you something before you go. He reached into a drawer and handed her a thick envelope. Inside were copied lecture notes, exercises, and an application form for correspondence study, the kind Princeton offered to distant students. I'd like you to keep learning, he said. You don't need walls to study. You only need patience and light. Emily turned the papers in her hands. Do you really think I could belong here someday? Hensley smiled. You already do. You just live far away. That afternoon, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then steady. Students hurried past with umbrellas, the stone paths glistening like ink. Emily stayed in the library until closing, copying her notes, writing small letters to herself in the margins. Remember the sound of wind. Remember that silence is not failure. Remember home. As the librarian dimmed the lights, she slipped one last sheet into her folder. A rough draft of an essay she called Persistence and Forgiveness in Analysis. It wasn't formal mathematics, more reflection than proof, but it carried her heart. In it she wrote, Every function that fades leaves behind a trace of what it was. That trace is not weakness, but witness. To forgive is to let the function smooth again, to keep its memory without keeping its pain. She left the essay on Hensley's desk with a small note. For reading when the term ends. Thank you for listening. Her last evening at Princeton was clear and sharp. The rain had washed the air clean. She walked once more through the main courtyard, the lamps glowing under the trees. Each window she passed held a small square of golden light, lives continuing in thought. At the fountain, she sat for a long while, notebook in her lap. The water's rhythm reminded her of Kansas rain on tin roofs, of the small diner and the sound of pages turning under her pencil. She opened the notebook to the very first page, the one she had written months ago. Things that do not vanish. The handwriting was uneven, the lines smudged, but the idea was still whole. Beneath it, she wrote in calm, steady letters, Light fades, but learning is its echo. Then she closed the book and pressed her palm against its cover, as if to seal something precious inside. The next morning, as she boarded the early train west, the sky over Princeton was just beginning to pale. Hensley was there on the platform, hands in his coat pockets. Keep writing, he said. Keep listening to the boundaries. I will, she promised. As the train began to move, she leaned out the window one last time. Professor, she called, what's the first rule of persistence? He smiled up at her. That even leaving can be a form of staying. She laughed softly and waved until he vanished from view. Through Pennsylvania, through Ohio, through the plains, the land opened wide again. The wheat waited, gold and endless. Emily rested her head against the glass, her notebook warm in her lap. She had crossed one boundary and was returning through another. When she finally saw the small water tower of Clay Center rise against the horizon, she whispered, Let me begin where I stopped. And in that moment, with the dawn pouring across the fields like light through old glass, she understood the shape of her own equation, not one of disappearance, but of return. The train slowed into Clay Center just as the morning sun caught the water tower, turning its faded silver into gold. From the window, Emily saw the same cracked streets, the same line of cottonwoods bending with the wind, and the same diner sign that flickered weakly even in daylight. Martha's Diner. It had been 3 months, but it felt like a lifetime. Martha was waiting at the platform, her apron still dusted with flour. When she saw Emily step down with her small duffel and the worn notebook under one arm, she waved, tears already shining in her eyes. You're thinner, she said as they hugged. You're shorter, Emily whispered back, smiling through tears. They stood there for a long moment, just breathing the Kansas air, dry, warm, and full of the sound of wheat bending somewhere beyond town. The diner looked smaller than she remembered. The walls, the counter, the old coffee machine, everything was the same, yet nothing was. The math books she had left behind still sat on the shelf near the register, the edges curling from heat and time. I left them right there, Martha said, wiping a cup. Didn't have the heart to move them. Emily touched the spine of the top book, her hand trembling slightly. I learned from these, she said softly. Now I think it's time someone else did too. That evening, after closing, Emily cleaned the counter until it shone. She pushed the old sugar jars aside, opened her notebook, and spread her papers across the polished metal. Martha watched from the doorway. What are you thinking, honey? I'm thinking, Emily said, that this counter was my first blackboard. Her mother smiled. Then maybe it's time to use it again. They worked together through the next week. Martha cleared one corner of the diner and hung a hand-painted sign above it. Cafe and Calculus. Underneath, in smaller letters, it read, Free math lessons. All ages welcome. At first, no one came. People looked in through the windows, curious but shy. Then, one evening, a boy of about 12 stepped inside. His jeans were torn, his hands dusty from the fields. He ordered a glass of milk and sat quietly until Emily smiled at him. You like puzzles? She asked. He shrugged. Sometimes. Then let's start with one, she said, pulling a napkin toward them. If I draw this curve, she began, sketching a simple parabola, how can we find the point where it turns? The boy leaned forward, eyes narrowing with focus. Martha watched from behind the counter, her heart full. That night, the boy left with his first small lesson in derivatives, though neither of them had used the word. By the next week, he returned with 2 friends. Then a neighbor's daughter came, then another. Within a month, every Thursday night, the diner filled with the low hum of pencils scratching and laughter breaking the quiet. In the middle of it all, Emily worked behind the counter, just as she always had. Except now her apron had chalk dust on it instead of coffee stains. She taught with patience and plain words. A derivative, she would tell them, is just a way of asking how fast something changes, how quickly the wind rises, how steep a hill becomes, how light fades at sunset. And when the lessons ended, she always said the same thing. Don't worry about getting every answer right. Math remembers you even when you forget it. The children nodded, not always understanding, but they felt the warmth behind the words. One evening, as the diner emptied and the lights dimmed, Martha poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her daughter. Do you ever think about going back? She asked. To Princeton, I mean. Emily smiled, stirring her cup. Every day, but not to stay, to remember. What I found there isn't gone. It's here now, in these kids, in this place. Her mother reached over, taking her hand. Your father would have loved this. You found a way to turn everything you learned into kindness. Emily's eyes softened. Maybe that's what learning was meant to do. Weeks passed into autumn. The air grew cooler, and the wheat fields faded from gold to pale straw. Still, every Thursday, the lights in Martha's diner glowed longer than any other building in town. Sometimes, when the children left, Emily stayed behind, writing in her notebook long after midnight. On one of those nights, she wrote, Education is not the privilege of the lucky. It is the persistence of light. She paused, thinking of Professor Hensley, of Princeton, of the sound of the chalk under her hand. Then, below it, she added another line. The boundary remembers because someone cared enough to stay. She tore out the page and pinned it above the counter, right beside the new sign that said, cafe and calculus. Months later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. The return address was Princeton University. Inside was a letter in Hensley's familiar handwriting. Dear Emily, I showed your essay on persistence to my class. They sat in silence afterward, the kind of silence that means understanding. If you ever open a school, send me a chalkboard from it. I would like to teach there for one afternoon. With pride, Robert Hensley. Emily smiled, folded the letter, and slipped it into the back of her notebook. That night, before closing, she walked to the door, turned off the lights, and stood in the quiet diner. The moonlight pooled across the counter where the first equations had once been drawn on napkins. She whispered softly, "Let me begin where I stopped." And as the wind swept past the diner, carrying the faint rustle of wheat from the dark fields beyond, Emily Grace Carter knew her work was only beginning, that the same light she had followed east now lived here, in the quiet heart of Kansas, glowing softly and refusing to vanish. Years passed quietly in Clay Center. The diner grew older, its neon sign dimmer, but every Thursday night the lights still burned late. Children came, studied, grew up, and sometimes returned years later with their own kids in tow. They called it Cafe and Calculus, but to everyone in town, it was simply Miss Carter's place. Emily never charged $1. She said knowledge couldn't be sold, it could only be carried, and she carried it well. By the time she was 30, a reporter from a Kansas newspaper came to write about her. He sat at the counter one afternoon while the children worked at the back, their notebooks open beside plates of pie. "Why math?" he asked, pencil ready. Emily smiled. "Because math forgives you when you're wrong. It lets you start again. And it always remembers what's true." The reporter looked around. "And this place? It used to be your mother's diner." "She gave people coffee," Emily said softly. "I give them a way to see the world clearly. It's the same thing, really." That article ran under the headline, "The Diner That Teaches Equations." A few months later, a small foundation offered to fund a second location, a place for traveling tutors and community math nights across rural Kansas. Emily accepted, but only under one condition, that it stay inside a cafe. "People think better," she said, "when they smell something warm." The years kept circling. Martha grew frailer, but her pride never dimmed. She would sit by the window, watching the children trace graphs on napkins, and whisper, "You see, Em? You turned the wind into numbers." When Martha passed quietly one winter morning, the diner filled with flowers and stories. Former students returned from towns all across the plains. Farmers, nurses, mechanics, a few teachers. They sat at the counter, crying softly, sharing memories of coffee and lessons that had changed their lives. That night, Emily locked the door early and sat in the dark diner alone. On the counter lay her mother's apron, folded neatly. She rested her head on it and wept, not for loss, but for gratitude. After a while, she opened her notebook, now nearly full. On the last blank page, she wrote, "For my mother, who taught me that the smallest act of care is the first proof of light." Years later, Emily received another letter, this one on heavy paper embossed with gold. It was from Princeton. Professor Hensley had retired, but the department had established a small scholarship fund in her name, the Carter Fellowship for Rural Learners. The letter closed with a single sentence written in Hensley's old hand. "You kept your promise. You listened to the boundaries." Emily placed the letter on the diner wall beside the first one he had ever sent her. Below it hung photographs, the children she'd taught, the shelves of books, the chalkboard she'd bought with her first small grant. Each picture was a fragment of a long equation that only life could solve. On the diner's 20th anniversary, one of her oldest students, now a physics teacher, gathered the townspeople for a surprise celebration. He read aloud a story of the girl who had once written integrals on napkins and had made Princeton listen. The crowd clapped and cheered, but Emily only laughed shyly, her hands folded in front of her apron. "I didn't change the world," she said. "I just refused to stop learning." The teacher shook his head. "Sometimes that's how the world changes." Late that night, after everyone had gone, Emily stood by the door and looked out across the fields. The wind was rising, bending the wheat into rippling patterns under the moonlight. She could almost hear it again. The same sound she'd heard as a child, the first whisper that had made her wonder why some things fade and others don't. She opened her notebook one last time. The first page was still there, faded but legible. Things that do not vanish. On the final line, she wrote, "Knowledge does not end. It passes quietly from one heart to another, like heat, like light, like forgiveness." She closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The wind wrapped around her like an old friend. Somewhere far away, another diner light flickered to life. The first branch of Cafe and Calculus. And across the quiet plains of Kansas, the lesson she had begun years ago kept spreading, slow and steady, like warmth through metal. Nothing that begins in kindness truly vanishes.